After nearly 4 decades of waiting, Frank Athen Walls faced his execution at Florida State Prison on December 18, 2025. But was the end of his life truly the conclusion everyone expected? Or did it only mark the end of one chapter in a much longer and darker story? For over 38 years, this case remained a part of Florida's history, leaving lingering questions that still need answers. What motivated a man to commit such horrifying acts, and why did justice take so long to catch up? Before we go further into this case, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell, so you won't miss the surprising twists and critical details of Frank Athen Walls' story that might change the way you think about justice. Frank Athen Walls, born on October 12, 1967, in Ocean City, Florida, had a troubled upbringing that set the stage for a life marked by criminal behavior. From an early age, his actions were indicative of a troubled mind, one that would eventually spiral into a series of violent crimes. By the time he was 17, he had already committed his first offense, setting a course that would alter the lives of many. In March of 1985, Tommy Lou Whitten, a 19-year-old college student, became the first victim of Walls' violent spree. While the investigation into her death initially seemed to stall, the disturbing nature of the crime raised suspicions that would later be confirmed. Walls was a killer, and this act was just the beginning. Over the following years, Walls' actions became increasingly erratic. In September of 1986, Cynthia Sue Condra, a 24-year-old woman, was found dead under similar circumstances. Despite initial leads, her case, like the first, grew cold, with no substantial evidence linking a suspect to the crime. Then, in 1987, Audrey Gaji, a 47-year-old woman, was murdered. The authorities struggled to connect the dots, but a chilling pattern was beginning to emerge. The violence was not random. It was part of a calculated and escalating series of events. Walls, it seemed, was growing bolder. However, it was in the summer of 1987 that Walls' crimes reached their peak. Edward Alger, a 22-year-old airman, and his 20-year-old girlfriend and Louise Peterson were found dead in their mobile home. This attack, marked by its brutality, sparked a renewed focus on the case. Detectives now had 2 victims from the same incident, increasing the urgency of their investigation. For years, Walls' name remained tied to these unsolved cases. Despite numerous theories and false leads, the authorities struggled to identify a clear suspect. As time passed, his crimes became part of the cold case files, leaving many wondering how such a dangerous individual could slip through the cracks for so long. His case would soon become one of the longest on Florida's death row, raising questions about the effectiveness of the justice system. But the story was far from over. Walls' fate and the lives of his victims would eventually intersect again, as the case that had remained unresolved for so long began to unravel. On March 26, 1985, Tommy Lou Whitten, a 19-year-old college student, found herself spending a quiet afternoon on Okaloosa Island, enjoying some peace amidst her studies. For her, it was just another calm day, one that would turn tragic and mark the beginning of a chilling series of events. Frank Athen Walls, just 17 at the time, was nearby. Without warning or explanation, he spotted Tommy Lou and approached her. What followed was swift and without confrontation, an act that forever changed both their lives. Tommy Lou's life was taken in an instant, leaving behind no witnesses and no immediate understanding of why. When authorities arrived, they were faced with a crime scene that offered no clear answers. Tommy Lou's tragic death was the start of a case that would grow increasingly complex. The investigation quickly ran into challenges. There were no obvious leads, no immediate suspects, and no known motives. Just an innocent life taken without explanation, leaving her family, friends, and community in a state of shock. Tommy Lou, a college student with big dreams for the future, had so much to look forward to, and her sudden death raised unsettling questions. As detectives searched for answers, the lack of clear evidence made their task even more difficult. There was no physical trace left behind, no obvious connection to a suspect. The police had little to go on. As days passed without new developments, the case stalled. With no witnesses or clues, the investigation felt like a dead end. Tommy Lou Whitten's death, which had initially felt like a random act, now hung in the air as part of a greater, darker mystery. Who would do such a thing? And why? These questions would go unanswered for a long time. The tragedy of Tommy Lou Whitten was just the beginning. But with no evidence pointing to the killer, investigators were left to wonder. Was this an isolated act, or the beginning of something much more darker? 18 months passed after the death of Tommy Lou Whitten, and the investigation was still at a standstill. But on September 16, 1986, Frank Athen Walls struck again, and this time the crime was even more disturbing. Cynthia Sue Condra, a 24-year-old woman, was found dead in a secluded area. The nature of her death was chilling, and it raised alarm for investigators. The crime was more violent than the previous one, but once again the police found themselves with no clear suspect. The police initially struggled to link Cynthia's murder to Walls. The lack of evidence at the scene and no obvious connection to previous victims made it hard to see the pattern forming. But as detectives worked tirelessly, they began to suspect that the case might be connected to other unsolved murders in the area, though they had no solid proof. Forensic investigators examined Cynthia Sue Condra's murder closely, searching for any clue that might lead them to the killer. A fingerprint found on a fan at the scene was one of the few pieces of evidence they uncovered. It was a lead, but it wasn't enough to make an arrest. The investigation faced a roadblock and Walls remained elusive. As the investigation continued, the authorities grew more desperate. They were now facing the reality that they were hunting a serial killer, someone who had grown more confident and bolder with each crime. The pressure mounted as the case remained unresolved, but just as investigators began to lose hope, another crime occurred. In May 1987, Audrey Gaji, a 47-year-old woman, was found dead in her home. The similarities between her murder and the previous cases were impossible to ignore. It seemed as though Walls had struck again. The violence was more calculated, and the connection to the earlier murders became undeniable. But even with this new lead, the investigation still faced challenges. The authorities were no closer to identifying their suspect than they had been at the start. Each new crime added more pieces to the puzzle, but the killer remained just out of reach. The investigation into Walls was far from over, and with each new victim, the pressure on the police intensified. They were dealing with a methodical, elusive killer who had already claimed multiple lives. The trail was cold, and yet the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to uncovering the truth. In the summer of 1987, after months of uncertainty and stalled progress, investigators finally found the breakthrough they had been waiting for. A seemingly insignificant item, a fan, became a pivotal clue in the case. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, just another piece of furniture in a crime scene. But after careful examination, authorities discovered a fingerprint on the fan that would change everything. This was the breakthrough that connected Frank Athen Walls to the murders. The fingerprint found at Audrey Gaji's crime scene provided the first concrete link to the suspect. The discovery brought a sense of urgency to the investigation, which had previously lacked direction. The fingerprint didn't just serve as a lead, it provided the necessary confirmation that the killer behind the earlier crimes was the same individual responsible for Audrey Gaji's death. But forensic evidence alone wasn't enough to ensure an arrest. Investigators continued to gather additional pieces of evidence from the crime scenes, including DNA samples that further solidified the connection between Walls and the murders. The new findings not only helped the investigation advance, but they also brought much-needed clarity to the chilling pattern of crimes that had remained unsolved for so long. While forensic evidence played a crucial role, the arrest of Walls was also made possible through the information provided by John Early, Walls' former roommate. Early had observed some troubling behavior from Walls and, after hearing about the investigation, became concerned. He reached out to law enforcement, sharing his suspicions. His tip provided the final piece of the puzzle, leading investigators directly to Walls. In August 1987, armed with the new evidence and Early's testimony, law enforcement was able to arrest Frank Athen Walls. The breakthrough in the case marked a significant turning point, though the process of bringing him to trial would still take several years. What had once seemed like an endless search for answers now seemed to have a definitive end in sight. In August 1987, after months of careful investigation, the authorities finally made a breakthrough. Frank Athen Walls was arrested after law enforcement uncovered items belonging to the victims inside his trailer. These pieces of evidence, such as a watch and wallets, had been taken from the crime scenes. The discovery of these items provided the necessary connection between Walls and the murders. The arrest of Walls marked the beginning of a long legal process that would last for decades. In 1988, Walls was charged with the murders of Edward Alger and Louise Peterson. The trial was a significant moment and he was convicted and sentenced to death. However, the case didn't end there. In a surprising turn, the Florida Supreme Court overturned the conviction the following year, citing procedural issues in the original trial. In 1992, a retrial took place. This time, Walls was found guilty once again, and the death sentence was reinstated. Despite the conviction, the legal process continued to be delayed. Over the years, Walls filed numerous appeals, arguing that his intellectual disabilities should prevent his execution. These appeals prolonged his time on death row, and his execution was repeatedly delayed. The case grew increasingly complex as Walls' legal team continued to argue for stays of execution. The appeals kept him on death row for nearly 38 years, and the question of whether justice would ever be truly served lingered. Each delay sparked new debates over the fairness of his sentence, and the case became a focal point for discussions on capital punishment and intellectual disability in the justice system. Finally, after years of legal battles, Walls was executed on December 18, 2025. His death, nearly 4 decades after his initial conviction, raised the question of whether the delays had been necessary or if justice had simply been deferred for far too long. After nearly 38 years on death row, Frank Athen Walls' final days arrived with a sense of finality that had been years in the making. His time in prison had been marked by a series of legal battles, each one pushing the execution further into the future. As the date of his execution approached, Walls spent his last days quietly, reflecting on the long journey that had brought him to this point. The state had made its decision, and there would be no more delays. On December 18, 2025, the day of his execution, Walls received his final meal, a simple meal of chicken, steak, and cheesecake, just hours before the execution. The meal, as routine as it seemed, marked the end of a long chapter in a case that had captivated the public for nearly 4 decades. At 6 p.m., Walls was escorted to the execution chamber, where his fate would finally be sealed. The execution took place by lethal injection, a method that had been controversial for many years, and the moment was somber. The long wait for justice had finally come to a close, but it wasn't without its share of questions. Some saw it as the rightful end to a long legal struggle, while others questioned whether such a lengthy process was the right approach. Walls' execution was the 19th for the year in Florida, marking a new record for the state. Florida had seen a significant rise in executions, with Walls' case being one of the most notable of that year. While many believed this execution was necessary, the number of executions in the state raised concerns about the fairness and efficiency of the capital punishment system. For the victims' families, the execution brought a form of closure, though it was clear that the emotional scars left by the crimes remained. Walls' death marked the final chapter of a case that had dragged on for nearly 4 decades, but the wounds left by his actions would never fully heal. The case of Frank Athen Walls raises important questions about the nature of justice and how it is pursued within the legal system. For nearly 4 decades, the legal battles surrounding his conviction delayed the closure his victims' families sought. After years of legal challenges and appeals, Walls' execution in 2025 marked the end of a long and drawn-out process, but it left many wondering whether the pursuit of justice was truly fulfilled. Was justice served in a timely manner, or did the delays only complicate the matter? While the case is now over, it is far from simple. It highlights the complexities of capital punishment, the issue of mental health, and the long-lasting impact on the families involved. For those waiting for closure, the years of uncertainty must have been unbearable, yet for some, the conclusion of this chapter still feels incomplete. As we reflect on this case, it's clear that the legal system can often be slow and, at times, flawed. But when faced with such difficult questions, one must ask, how long is too long for justice? Was the delay worth it, or did it simply create more pain for everyone involved? What do you think? Was the long wait for justice justified, or were the delays unnecessary? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to continue exploring more true crime stories like this one, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. By doing so, you'll be able to stay updated on future cases that have shocked the world and continue to dive deep into the mysteries that remain unresolved.